I am Evelyn. I am 26 years old. Exactly 3 years ago, on a blindingly hot Tuesday afternoon, my own father used the heavy steel door of his luxury car to crush my skull. He did it in broad daylight, in a public space, with the full intention of destroying me completely. While I was collapsed on the searing hot asphalt, bleeding heavily from my head and fighting to stay conscious, my mother did not scream for help. She did not rush to my side. She stood there clutching a fresh bottle of red wine, looking down at my blood pooling around her expensive designer shoes. She laughed. A cold, drunken, evil laugh. She looked at the man who had just fractured my skull and said, "The blood really brings out your worthlessness." Slam her again. They mocked me as I was dying, standing over me in that parking lot, utterly convinced that their wealth and status made them untouchable. They thought I was just the same silent, worthless punching bag I had always been. But there is one massive detail they did not know. Just seconds before the impact, my thumb had found the screen of my phone. I had already dialed 911. Every single hateful word, every sickening laugh, and the exact sound of my skull cracking was being recorded by the emergency dispatcher. And right now, the two people who brought me into this world are wearing matching orange jumpsuits, rotting away in state prison, begging for a forgiveness they will never, ever receive. Before I tell you the exact steps I took to completely dismantle my abusers and send them to prison, please hit that like button if you believe that absolute justice exists in this world. And please go to the comments right now and let me know where you are watching from. Your support helps me keep sharing this journey. Now, let us go back to the exact moment the suffocating heat in that car turned into a fight for my life. It was late August. The kind of oppressive, suffocating heat that makes the air shimmer above the pavement. We were parked outside a high-end grocery store in our wealthy suburban town. I was trapped in the back seat of my father's pristine, midnight blue Porsche SUV. The air conditioning had been broken for weeks. Now, my father, Richard, was a phenomenally wealthy man. He pulled a massive salary from his commercial real estate firm. He bought a new luxury vehicle every 2 years. He could have fixed that air conditioning unit with a single phone call and pocket change. But he actively refused. He told me it built character for me to sit in the heat. The reality was much darker. He simply enjoyed watching me suffer. He enjoyed the power of denying me basic comfort. I was sitting in the back, trying to make myself completely invisible. It was a survival mechanism I had perfected over 2 decades. If I did not speak, if I did not move, if I did not take up space, maybe I could avoid his wrath. The temperature inside the car was well over 100 degrees. The heavy, black leather seats were baking my skin through my thin cotton shirt. Sweat was dripping down my neck, stinging my eyes. The air was so thick and stagnant it felt like trying to breathe underwater. I folded my hands tightly in my lap, stared directly at the back of his headrest, and tried to regulate my breathing. I took a breath, just slightly deeper than the last, desperately trying to get some oxygen into my burning lungs. My father's dark eyes immediately darted to the rearview mirror. He locked eyes with me through the reflection. His face was already flushed red from the heat, and his jaw muscles were twitching. He hated the sound of my breathing. He hated the space I occupied. He hated my very existence. "You sound like a dog panting back there," he snapped. His voice was sharp, low, and incredibly dangerous. I instantly tightened my chest. I held my breath until my lungs screamed for release. "I am sorry," I whispered. I was always apologizing. I apologized for eating, for walking, for existing. I apologized for not being the perfect, aggressive son they had always wanted. At that moment, my mother, Margaret, emerged from the automatic sliding doors of the grocery store. She was swaying slightly as she walked, her oversized designer sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly highlighted hair. She carried 2 expensive bottles of red wine. She opened the passenger door, and the sour stench of stale alcohol rolled into the suffocating car before she even sat down. She had been drinking since breakfast. She looked back at me, her eyes glassy, unfocused, and entirely devoid of maternal warmth. "What is the drama now?" she asked, noticing the thick tension and the furious vein bulging in my father's neck. "Your daughter is panting like an animal again," he growled, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. My mother let out a sharp, cruel laugh that scraped against my eardrums. "Maybe she is part dog. It would certainly explain why she is such a bitch." They both chuckled. It was a sickening moment of absolute unity. The only time my parents truly loved each other was when they were tearing me to shreds. I pressed my spine hard against the scorching leather seat. My right hand slid very slowly, very carefully into my pants pocket. My fingers wrapped around my smartphone. 3 months earlier, my father had grabbed my left hand and snapped my wrist backwards simply because I was typing on my laptop too loudly while he was trying to watch a golf tournament. I had promised myself that day, staring at my swollen, purple skin while lying to the emergency room doctor about falling down the stairs, that I would never, ever let them hurt me without proof again. I had pre-dialed 911 on my keypad before we even left the house. All I had to do was slide my thumb over the green call button. My father suddenly unbuckled his seatbelt. The metallic click sounded like a gunshot in the quiet car. He moved with a terrifying, deliberate calmness. He opened his door, stepped out into the blistering heat, and walked around the back of the Porsche toward my side. Panic flooded my veins. I scrambled across the seat, desperately trying to hit the lock button, but the child's safety locks were engaged. The system designed to keep children safe was the exact mechanism keeping me trapped in a metal cage with a monster. He grabbed the handle and ripped the heavy door open. The blinding afternoon sunlight hit my face, immediately followed by his massive, heavy hand grabbing my shoulder. He dug his fingers into my collarbone and violently yanked me forward, pulling me halfway out of the vehicle. I tried to brace myself against the doorframe, but I was weak from the heat exhaustion and the sheer terror paralyzing my muscles. My mother leaned completely over the center console, a twisted smirk playing on her lips. "God, even her fear is annoying," she slurred, taking a swig from a water bottle she had likely spiked. That was the moment he did it. He let go of my shoulder, took a half step back, and swung the heavy, reinforced steel door forward with every ounce of strength he possessed. He used his entire body weight. The solid edge of the door caught me directly on the right temple. The sound was horrifying. A sickening, hollow crack that vibrated through my jaw and down my spine. The pain did not register as pain at first. It was a blinding flash of white light that consumed my entire field of vision, followed instantly by the thick, undeniable taste of copper flooding my mouth. I felt the bone of my skull compress. I felt the skin split open. My knees buckled instantly. My body went completely limp, and I collapsed hard onto the searing asphalt. My head throbbed with an agony so profound I thought my brain was bleeding out onto the concrete. Through my blurred, red-tinted vision, I saw his expensive leather loafers. I heard his heavy, angry breathing. He stood over me, looking down at his own child like I was a piece of garbage that had stained his driveway. "Maybe now your skull matches your IQ," he roared, his voice echoing across the parking lot. My right hand was trapped underneath my stomach. My thumb felt the smooth glass of the phone screen. Muscle memory took over. I pressed the green button. I felt the tiny vibration as the call connected to the emergency dispatcher. I knew I had to stay conscious just long enough to establish the scene. I managed to part my bloody lips, keeping my face turned toward the pavement, and I whispered hoarsely into the phone hidden beneath me. "Help. Parking lot." Then I closed my eyes and played dead. I let every single muscle in my body go completely slack. I stopped fighting the darkness pulling at the edges of my mind. Above me, I heard my mother giggle. It was a light, carefree sound that chilled me to my core. "The blood really brings out your worthlessness," she mocked, the smell of wine wafting down to me. "Drama queen is probably faking. Slam her again." I lay there, the heat of the asphalt literally burning the skin off my cheek, my blood pooling around my face and soaking into my hair. I heard his heavy footsteps shift backward. He was actually pulling the door back. He was calculating the angle for a second, deadly blow. The recording was capturing every single second of their depravity. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong. The wail of the siren started as a distant, high-pitched hum and rapidly escalated into a deafening, terrifying scream. The 911 dispatcher had heard my desperate whisper, followed by my father's violent threats and my mother's drunken encouragement. The police response was immediate and overwhelming. The heavy silence of my parents' cruelty was shattered. I heard my father freeze. A sharp, panicked curse ripped from his throat. The arrogant billionaire CEO vanished, replaced instantly by a cornered criminal. "Shit," he hissed. "Now we have to deal with this." My mother shrieked in surprise and dropped her wine bottle. The thick glass shattered against the concrete just inches from my head. The deep crimson liquid splashed across the pavement, mixing directly with my blood. It formed a grotesque, abstract painting of violence and alcoholism right there in the parking lot. Tires screeched violently as a police cruiser jumped the curb and angled itself perfectly to block the Porsche from backing out. A massive ambulance was right behind it, its red and blue lights flashing wildly against the grocery store windows. I stayed perfectly still, maintaining my facade of unconsciousness until I felt the gentle, highly trained hands of a female EMT on my neck. She slid her fingers expertly along my cervical spine, securing my neck before leaning down close to my ear. I opened my eyes slowly. I looked past the blinding sun and focused on her name tag. Sarah. I parted my lips, tasting the iron of my own blood again, and whispered directly to her. He slammed my head in the door. On purpose. Because I was breathing too loud. Sarah's jaw tightened instantly. She looked closely at the right side of my head. There was a clear, horrifying imprint of the vehicle's weather stripping pressed deeply into my swollen, split skin. It was an undeniable mechanical pattern of assault. She looked back into my eyes, her expression shifting from medical concern to fierce, protective rage. "We have you now, sweetheart," she said firmly. "You're safe." The world faded in and out in disjointed flashes as they strapped me onto the backboard and lifted me onto the stretcher. I heard officers shouting aggressive commands at my father. "Step away from the girl. Hands where I can see them." My father tried to use his standard manipulation tactics. "Officers, please, this is my daughter," he protested, using his smooth, persuasive boardroom voice. "She is incredibly clumsy. She fell against the car. She has always been a troubled girl. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, sir," the officer barked, completely unbothered by his expensive suit. I heard the unmistakable, heavy click of steel handcuffs locking around my father's wrists. It was the sweetest, most melodic sound I had ever heard in my entire 26 years of life. I woke up hours later in a sterile, freezing hospital room. The sharp smell of antiseptic bleach was overpowering. My head was wrapped tightly in thick gauze, and the steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor filled the quiet space. Dr. Eris, a seasoned trauma physician with kind, exhausted eyes, walked into the room holding a digital tablet. He pulled up a plastic chair beside my bed and sat down heavily. He did not give me a look of pity, which I deeply appreciated. He dealt in facts, and right now I needed the truth. "Evelyn," Dr. Eris said, his voice grave and professional. "You have suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. There is a visible hairline fracture on your temporal bone. I need you to understand how close you came to dying today. A few more pounds of pressure, a slightly different angle, and you would not be having this conversation with me right now." I swallowed the dry lump in my throat, wincing at the pain radiating down my neck. I was alive. I had survived the beast. He tapped his screen, bringing up a series of black and white X-ray images. "But the acute injury is not what concerns my team the most," he continued, turning the screen toward me. "These scans show the complete history of your skeletal structure. We found multiple healed fractures that you never reported. A severe break in your left wrist from approximately 3 months ago that healed incorrectly. Hairline fractures in your lower ribs that appear to be several years old. Microfractures in your collarbone. Evelyn, your bones are telling a very clear story of long-term, systemic physical abuse. Hearing a medical professional validate my reality was utterly overwhelming. A hot tear slipped down my cheek. For my entire life, I had been aggressively gaslit into believing my pain was my own fault. I was told I was clumsy. I was told I was overly dramatic. I was told I bruised easily because of a poor diet. In reality, I was the designated family scapegoat. All the family wealth, the constant praise, the expensive private schools, the massive college fund, and the future real estate inheritance went entirely to my older brother, Arthur. Arthur was the golden child, the chosen one. He could do absolutely no wrong. He currently lived in a sprawling luxury condo downtown, fully paid for by my parents, while I had to scrape together every single penny from my meager administrative salary just to buy groceries. I had moved out the very day I turned 18, vowing never to return to that house of horrors. But life is rarely fair. A year ago, the logistics company I worked for went bankrupt. I lost my job, my tiny apartment, and my health insurance in a matter of 3 devastating weeks. I had absolutely no safety net. I had no choice but to swallow my pride and move back into the damp basement of their sprawling suburban mansion while I desperately submitted resumes and tried to rebuild my savings. Moving back was a strict financial necessity, but it had nearly cost me my life. Dr. Eris paused, looking at me carefully before speaking again. The police detectives need to come in and take a formal statement soon. But before they do, I need to share a piece of information they found during the vehicle inspection. The police impounded the Porsche at the scene. When the mechanics inspected the vehicle, they discovered that the air conditioning was not simply broken due to wear and tear. The wiring unit located deep under the dashboard had been intentionally, cleanly severed with industrial wire cutters. My blood ran ice cold. The monitor beside my bed began to beep faster. The heat. The unbearable, suffocating heat in that car that triggered my father's violent rage over the simple sound of my breathing. My father was a man who paid people to change his light bulbs. He did not know how to hold a screwdriver, let alone navigate the complex electrical wiring of a German luxury vehicle. But Arthur did. Arthur was obsessed with cars. Arthur loved restoring engines. And more than anything, Arthur loved watching my father humiliate and destroy me. Arthur had visited the house the night before for one of our forced family dinners. He had deliberately cut those wires, knowing full well my father would force me to ride in the back seat the next day to run errands with my mother. Arthur knew the heat would turn our father into a violent monster, and he knew exactly who the target would be. It was a premeditated setup. My own brother had engineered my torture just for his own twisted entertainment. I gripped the thin hospital sheets until my knuckles turned bright white. The betrayal ran so much deeper than I could have ever imagined. The entire family structure was a toxic, rotting ecosystem built entirely on my suffering. Before I could even begin to process this horrifying revelation, the heavy wooden door of my hospital room swung open. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. My father and mother were not there. They were currently sitting in county lockup waiting for arraignment. But the people who walked into my room were just as dangerous. It was my Aunt Beatrice, my mother's older sister, and my Uncle Thomas, my father's younger brother. They walked in wearing their expensive country club attire, their faces perfectly plastered with expressions of deep, artificial concern. Aunt Beatrice rushed straight to my bedside, reaching out with her manicured hands to stroke my arm. I flinched violently, pulling away so hard I strained my neck. She did not miss a single beat. She just smiled. It was a thin, chilling, reptilian smile that did not reach her cold eyes. "Oh, Evelyn, darling," Beatrice cooed, her voice dripping with sickly sweet, fake sympathy. "We came exactly as soon as we heard the terrible news about your little accident." An accident. I was lying in a trauma ward with a fractured skull, and they were already actively rewriting history. And I knew, looking at their calculating faces, that the real battle for my life, my sanity, and my justice was only just beginning. "It was not a little accident, Beatrice," I said. My voice was hoarse from the intubation tube they had used earlier, but it was completely, undeniably steady. He intentionally slammed the car door into my head. He tried to kill me. Beatrice let out a long, dramatic sigh. She looked around the sterile hospital room as if the walls themselves were wearing wiretaps. She pulled up a chair, dragging it uncomfortably close to my bed. I could smell her heavy, overpowering floral perfume. It smelled exactly like decaying roses at a funeral. "Evelyn, please, let us be reasonable adults about this situation," Beatrice whispered, instantly dropping the sympathetic aunt routine. Her tone turned sharp and commanding. "Your father is a highly respected man. He is a pillar of this community. He sits on the board of the country club. Do you have any idea what a criminal scandal like this will do to his real estate business? To our family legacy? To your future inheritance? You are clearly confused from the head injury and the pain medication. You tripped in the parking lot. You lost your balance and hit your head on the door frame. That is exactly what you are going to tell the police detectives when they come back into this room." She was actively trying to gaslight a victim of attempted murder while I was literally attached to a heart monitor. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. She did not care about my fractured skull. She did not care that I almost died. She cared entirely about the money. She cared about the social status and the whispers at her weekly HOA meetings. Before I could formulate a response to her disgusting demands, Uncle Thomas stepped forward. He always played the role of the benevolent patriarch, the reasonable, wealthy uncle who fixed problems with his checkbook. "Evelyn, you need to listen to your aunt," Thomas said, casually adjusting the knot of his expensive silk tie. "I know things got a little out of hand today. We all know your father has a bit of a temper. But going to the police? Filing a formal lawsuit? That destroys families permanently. Tell you what, we are family. You drop the criminal charges immediately, you tell the authorities you were simply hysterical and confused, and I will personally pay your entire hospital bill out of my own pocket. I will even set up a generous monthly allowance for you so you can finally get your own apartment downtown. You can start fresh, far away from your father. Does that not sound like a win-win?" It was an incredibly tempting offer for someone who was entirely broke, unemployed, and facing massive medical debt. But I looked deeply into Thomas's eyes and saw nothing but cold, corporate calculation. He was not trying to help me escape. He was trying to buy my silence. My father's real estate empire was vast, and Thomas owned a significant percentage of the subsidiary companies. Keeping my father out of a messy, highly publicized criminal trial was Thomas's ultimate leverage to protect his own massive salary and stock options. When I did not answer immediately, Thomas's friendly demeanor shifted instantly. The mask slipped. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. "I really hoped we could do this the easy, civilized way, Evelyn," he muttered, his voice dropping an octave. He tapped the screen a few times and held the phone up toward my face. It was an audio recording. I heard my own voice playing from the tiny speaker. It was weak, crying, heavily slurred, and deeply medicated from the strong painkillers they had pumped into my fore when I first arrived in the emergency room. I was rambling incoherently. I was crying out, saying things that made absolutely no logical sense, begging for my mother to come hold my hand. It was raw, intensely vulnerable, and deeply humiliating to listen to. The trauma nurses left the room for a few minutes while you were waking up from the deep sedation, Thomas explained smoothly, pocketing the phone with a smug look. "I walked in and recorded this. Now, if you try to testify against your father in a court of law, I will not hesitate to release this audio directly to the press. I will hire the most aggressive defense lawyer in the state to paint you as a mentally unstable, drug-addicted, hysterical young woman who is desperately trying to extort her wealthy, loving parents. Who do you honestly think a jury will believe? A highly successful, charismatic CEO, or a broke, mentally ill girl who lives rent-free in his basement?" The betrayal hit me so hard it felt like a physical blow to my chest. My own uncle. My flesh and blood. He had stood by my hospital bed, watching his niece suffer in a drug-induced, traumatized haze, and his first instinct was to use it to gather blackmail material to protect his real estate portfolio. He wanted a bigger cut of the family business, and my silence was his currency. I stared at the two of them. Beatrice with her fake, tightened smile and expensive pearls. Thomas with his ruthless, corporate glare and threatening posture. For 26 years, I would have caved instantly. I would have started crying, apologized profusely for causing trouble, and signed whatever non-disclosure agreements they shoved in front of my face. But the scared, compliant girl who would have done that died on the burning asphalt in that grocery store parking lot. The woman sitting in this hospital bed had absolutely nothing left to lose. I slowly reached up with my uninjured hand and pressed the red call button for the nurse station. The alarm began to beep loudly in the hallway outside my door. "What the hell are you doing?" Beatrice hissed, her eyes widening in genuine panic as she looked at the door. "I am setting a boundary," I said calmly, maintaining direct eye contact with her. The heavy door swung open, and Clara walked in. Clara was my best friend, my former college roommate, and the absolute only person in the entire world who knew the horrific truth about my family dynamic. She was a brilliant senior paralegal at a high-end corporate law firm downtown. She was sharp as a tack, impeccably dressed, and fiercely loyal. Right behind her was Officer Miller, a seasoned police detective with a stern, deeply lined face and a heavy notepad ready in his hand. "Evelyn," Officer Miller asked, stepping authoritatively past my stunned aunt and uncle. "Are you physically ready to give your official statement?" Thomas quickly took a step back, his face draining of all color. "Officer, my niece is highly medicated right now. She is clearly not in her right mind to be giving legally binding." "Shut up, Thomas," I said loudly, my voice cutting through the sterile room like a steel whip. I did not look at him. I looked directly at Officer Miller. "Detective, I want to file a formal lawsuit. I want to press full criminal charges for attempted murder against my father, Richard, and charges for accessory to attempted murder against my mother, Margaret. And I want these two people removed from my hospital room immediately, or I will formally press charges against them for witness tampering, intimidation, and criminal extortion." Beatrice audibly gasped, dramatically clutching her pearl necklace as if I had physically struck her. Thomas looked like he had just swallowed poison. Officer Miller turned slowly to face them, his right hand resting casually near his heavy-duty belt. He did not look amused. "You heard the lady," Officer Miller growled, jerking his thumb toward the hallway. "Step out. Right now. Before I decide to search your phones for evidence of this alleged extortion." Watching my wealthy, arrogant relatives scramble out of the hospital room like terrified rats fleeing a sinking ship was the very first taste of true, undeniable power I had ever experienced in my life. Clara rushed straight to my side, grabbing my hand and squeezing it tightly. "I am so incredibly proud of you," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. I turned back to Officer Miller and gave him the full, unvarnished story. I told him about the decades of psychological abuse. I told him about the broken wrist 3 months ago. I told him about Arthur deliberately shattering the AC wires to trigger my father's rage. And I told him exactly how my father had deliberately, maliciously used the heavy steel door of his Porsche to try and crush my skull. I held absolutely nothing back. I was officially going to war against my own bloodline. I knew exactly how dirty they would play. I knew they would use their immense wealth to try and crush me. But I also knew I had the absolute truth on my side. As night finally fell over the hospital, Clara sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside my bed, pulling out a legal pad to help me plan my next moves. But I knew that somewhere out there in the city, Arthur was slowly realizing that his perfect, fully funded life was about to violently crumble. And my golden child brother was not going to go down without a brutal fight. The grueling weeks leading up to the preliminary trial were an absolute psychological war zone. My father, using his vast corporate resources, had immediately retained the services of Vance, the most ruthless, high-priced criminal defense attorney in the entire state. Vance was infamous in legal circles for utterly destroying victims on the witness stand. He did not care about truth or justice. He cared strictly about winning high-profile cases and keeping his exorbitant hourly fees flowing. True to Uncle Thomas's vicious threat at the hospital, the media smear campaign started almost immediately. Vance's PR team expertly leaked carefully crafted, highly manipulated stories to the local tabloids and news stations. Horrific articles started popping up online, painting me as a deeply troubled, rebellious, and mentally unstable daughter who had a long, documented history of self-harm. They framed the gruesome incident in the parking lot as a tragic, unavoidable accident, a desperate, loving father trying to physically restrain a hysterical daughter who accidentally hit her own head on the car door during a violent manic episode. They weaponized my financial struggles against me. They highlighted my lack of a high-paying salary, my recent unemployment, and the fact that I had moved back into their basement. They masterfully crafted a narrative making me look like a desperate, greedy gold digger who was maliciously going after my parents' massive real estate and my brother's future inheritance. It was utterly infuriating and deeply exhausting. I had to completely delete my social media apps and stop watching the local news just to protect my fragile sanity. I moved out of my parents' house permanently and moved in with Clara, sleeping on a cheap inflatable air mattress in the living room of her tiny, one-bedroom apartment because I adamantly refused to accept or touch a single dime of my family's dirty money. I was completely broke, constantly dizzy, still recovering from a severe traumatic brain injury, and attempting to fight a billionaire's elite legal team with nothing but the truth. But I possessed something that Vance, my parents, and my extended family fundamentally misunderstood. I had the 911 audio recording. However, Arthur, my brilliant, sociopathic brother, knew about the call. He had figured out the timeline. He knew that the only possible way to save our parents from decades in state prison, and by direct extension, completely save his massive trust fund, his luxury condo, and his guaranteed inheritance, was to locate and permanently destroy the digital evidence before the trial began. One rainy Tuesday evening, Clara and I were sitting at her small kitchen table, exhausted, poring over piles of printed legal documents and medical records. Suddenly, my phone screen lit up brightly with an urgent security notification. It was a critical alert from my primary iCloud account. Security alert. Someone is attempting to log into your account from an unrecognized device in your geographical area. Please enter the verification code. My stomach instantly dropped into my shoes. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Clara, I gasped, my voice trembling as I shoved the phone across the table to show her the screen. Arthur. It has to be Arthur. He is actively trying to hack into my cloud storage. He is trying to find and delete the 911 recording. Arthur was a tech genius. He had always been the one to set up the family's home networks. He intimately knew my old passwords, he knew the answers to my security questions, and he knew my digital habits. I watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as a second notification popped up on the screen, indicating a formal password reset request had been initiated. If he successfully bypassed the two-factor authentication and got full access to that account, he could trigger a remote wipe command on my phone. He could permanently delete the absolute, only indisputable proof. Give me the phone right now, Clara demanded. Her demeanor instantly shifted from exhausted friend to hyper-focused legal professional. Her fingers flew aggressively across the keyboard of her own work laptop. We need to secure the root file and lock down the network. Now. She grabbed a cable and plugged my phone directly into her laptop, trying to establish a hardwired connection to intercept the wipe command. But Arthur was incredibly fast. The screen on my phone suddenly glitched, flashing violently before going completely black. The dreaded Apple logo appeared, signaling that a full factory reset and remote wipe command was actively being executed. I felt the air violently leave my lungs. I gripped the edge of the kitchen table, feeling a massive panic attack rising in my chest. Everything I had fought for, the skull fracture, the public humiliation, the loss of my entire family, it was all about to vanish into the digital ether. No, 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 please, I panicked, watching the slow, agonizing progress bar appear on my darkened screen. Suddenly, Clara's work phone sitting on the counter rang loudly. The caller ID flashed a name that made us both freeze: Eleanor Sterling. Eleanor Sterling was the ruthless CEO and senior managing partner of the massive corporate law firm where Clara worked. She was an absolute legend in the legal world, a powerhouse woman who took absolutely no prisoners in the courtroom. Clara had quietly, nervously brought my case file to Eleanor's attention a week ago, desperately hoping for some off-the-record legal advice from the master. Clara scrambled to answer the phone and immediately put it on speaker. "Miss Sterling, we have a massive emergency. Someone is initiating a remote wipe on Evelyn's device right this second." "I am well aware, Clara." Eleanor's incredibly calm, commanding, aristocratic voice filled the small kitchen. "I currently have my senior IT security department tracking the IP address of the breach. It is pinging directly from a luxury high-rise condo downtown. That would be Arthur's primary residence, I presume." "Yes," I yelled at the phone, tears of sheer frustration spilling down my cheeks. "It is Arthur. He is deleting the 911 call from the server." "Let him," Eleanor said smoothly, her tone completely unbothered. I stared at the phone in absolute shock. "What do you mean, let him? That audio file is my entire case. If he deletes it, I have nothing." "Evelyn, take a deep breath and listen to me very carefully," Eleanor said, her tone dripping with the kind of absolute, terrifying confidence that costs corporate clients $1,000 an hour. "The very day Clara bravely brought your personal file to my desk and I read the police report, I instructed our firm's tech team to mirror your entire iCloud account. We downloaded every single byte of data onto our firm's heavily encrypted, offline legal servers. We established an airtight, legally binding chain of custody for the evidence." I stopped breathing. "Arthur is currently deleting a ghost," Eleanor continued, a hint of a dark smile evident in her voice. "He is aggressively destroying evidence on a personal device, which my tech team is currently documenting in real time as felony tampering with evidence and cyber intrusion. He thinks he is saving his inheritance. In reality, he is digging his own legal grave, and he does not even have the slightest clue." I collapsed back into my chair, burying my face in my trembling hands. The sheer relief washing over me was so immense, so powerful, I actually began to violently sob. They had outsmarted him. My arrogant, brilliant brother thought he had won. He thought he had successfully saved the family fortune and silenced his worthless sister once again. "Evelyn, pull yourself together," Eleanor instructed, her voice softening just a fraction, speaking woman to woman. "Tomorrow morning is the first official day of the preliminary trial. Vance is absolutely going to put you on the witness stand. He is going to try to systematically break your spirit. He is going to call you a liar, a manipulator, and a crazy woman in front of a packed courtroom. You are going to sit there, you are going to look that arrogant man dead in the eye, and you are not going to give him a single inch. Let them build their entire, elaborate defense on the absolute lie that there is no audio evidence. Let them perjure themselves. And then we drop the hammer." I wiped my eyes roughly with the back of my hand. A fierce, burning, undeniable resolve settled deep into my bones, replacing the fear that had lived there my entire life. For 26 years, my family had operated entirely in the shadows, hiding their cruelty behind closed mansion doors, aggressively protecting their pristine public image at the terrible cost of my sanity and my physical safety. Now, the grand stage was perfectly set for the ultimate reckoning. The trial was tomorrow. The legal trap was set flawlessly. My parents and my brother truly thought they had silenced me forever. They were about to learn, in the most brutal way possible, that silence is just the deep, steady breath you take right before you scream your truth to the entire world. The morning of the preliminary trial arrived with a heavy, suffocating humidity that reminded me entirely too much of that August afternoon in the grocery store parking lot. I stood in front of the massive bathroom mirror in Clara's tiny apartment, adjusting the collar of my cheap, off-the-rack suit. I stared at my own reflection. I was a young man, a son who had survived an execution attempt by the very man who was supposed to teach him how to navigate the world. My father, Richard, always wanted a vicious, aggressive, alpha male son who would ruthlessly take over his real estate empire. He got that in my older brother, Arthur. I was the quiet one, the observant one, the one who asked too many questions. And for that, I was the designated target of their. Clara knocked gently on the doorframe. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored blazer, holding a thick leather briefcase containing the meticulously organized files of my lawsuit. Behind her stood Eleanor Sterling, the senior managing partner of her law firm. Eleanor had insisted on accompanying us to the courthouse. She did not officially represent me on the criminal record. The state prosecutor, a brilliant woman named Ramirez, handled that, but Eleanor wanted to be there to watch the trap snapshot. She looked at me with her piercing, calculating eyes. She told me to keep my posture straight, to keep my voice completely level, and to let my family drown in their own profound arrogance. We pulled up to the downtown courthouse. The media circus was already in full swing. Vance, my father's high-priced defense lawyer, had done an exceptional job of turning this criminal trial into a high-society spectacle. Reporters swarmed the concrete steps, holding heavy cameras and shouting rapid-fire questions as we walked through the heavy security doors. I ignored all of them. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, focusing solely on the heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B. Walking into that courtroom felt like stepping directly into a lion's den. The air was thick with tension and the smell of expensive cologne. And there they were. My family. They sat at the defense table looking like they were attending an exclusive charity gala rather than an attempted murder trial. My father wore a bespoke, charcoal gray Italian suit. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and he was casually leaning back in his heavy wooden chair, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable power. Beside him sat my mother, Margaret. She wore a conservative, navy blue designer dress and a string of authentic pearls. She was actively dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a silk tissue, playing the role of the devastated, heartbroken matriarch to perfection. And directly behind them, in the first row of the gallery, sat Arthur, the golden child. He wore a smug, relaxed smirk on his face. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the wooden partition, looking at me like I was a pathetic bug he was about to crush under his expensive leather shoe. Arthur truly believed he had successfully wiped my iCloud account the night before. He believed he had permanently deleted the 911 audio file, effectively destroying my entire case and securing his massive future inheritance. He looked incredibly proud of himself. I looked right back at him and offered absolutely nothing. No anger. No fear. Just a cold, blank stare. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he quickly recovered his arrogant posture. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down. The judge, a stern, older man with a reputation for zero tolerance, called the court to order. Prosecutor Ramirez delivered a sharp, fact-based opening statement outlining the brutal timeline of the assault. But it was Vance's turn that set the stage for the absolute psychological warfare to come. Vance stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, and approached the jury box with the smooth, practiced grace of a seasoned predator. He painted a masterful, entirely fabricated picture of my family dynamic. He described my father as a generous, loving patriarch who had built a massive real estate dynasty from nothing. He described my mother as a dedicated, loving wife. And then, he turned his sights on me. He painted me as the deeply troubled, ungrateful son. He brought up my recent unemployment. He explicitly mentioned my lack of a competitive salary and my inability to secure my own housing. He told the jury that I was a deeply disturbed young man who harbored a vicious jealousy toward my successful older brother. He framed the entire law. It was a brilliant, disgusting piece of legal fiction. And the worst part was, I could see a few of the jurors nodding slightly, taking notes, buying into the narrative of the wealthy, respectable family victimized by their crazy, greedy son. Then my name was called. It was time for me to take the witness stand. I walked past the defense table. I could feel the heat radiating from my father's intense glare. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the absolute truth, and sat down in the hard wooden chair. Prosecutor Ramirez walked me through the basic events of that day. I answered her questions clearly and concisely. I detailed the suffocating heat in the car, the verbal abuse, the moment the heavy door struck my skull, and the horrific dialogue that followed. But Ramirez was just laying the groundwork. We both knew the real battle was the cross-examination. When Ramirez sat down, Vance practically leaped out of his chair. He approached the podium like a shark smelling blood in the water. "Evan," Vance began, his voice dripping with condescension. "You testified today that your father intentionally slammed the door of his luxury vehicle into your head. Is that correct?" "Yes," I replied smoothly. "And you claim this brutal, premeditated attack was triggered simply because you were breathing too loudly?" Vance asked, raising his eyebrows in exaggerated disbelief toward the jury box. "Does that honestly sound like the rational behavior of a highly successful corporate CEO, or does it sound like a dramatic fabrication from a young man who is angry about being forced to live in his parents' basement?" "It is exactly what happened," I stated firmly. Vance paced in front of the jury box. "Let us talk about your financial situation, Evan. Isn't it true that you recently lost your job? Isn't it true that you had zero income, zero savings, and zero prospects when you moved back into your parents' home?" "I was experiencing financial hardship, yes." "Hardship," Vance scoffed loudly. "You were completely broke. Meanwhile, your older brother Arthur has a successful career, a luxury condo, and a secure future. You resented that, didn't you? You hated seeing him thrive while you failed. And when your father refused to simply hand you an unearned promotion within his real estate firm, you decided to stage an accident. You threw yourself violently against that car door to create an injury, intending to file a massive civil lawsuit to secure a payout. You are trying to steal your brother's inheritance, aren't you?" "Objection," Ramirez called out from her table. "Argumentative and entirely speculative." "Sustained," the judge ruled instantly. "Mr. Vance, stick to the facts of the day in question." Vance smiled thinly. "My apologies, Your Honor." He turned back to me, leaning heavily on the wooden podium. "Evan, you claim your parents stood over you and mocked you while you were allegedly bleeding on the pavement. That is a horrific accusation. But let us be absolutely clear with the court today. You have absolutely no proof of this conversation, do you? It is simply your word, the word of a financially desperate, disgruntled son, against the word of two highly respected members of this community. There are no witnesses who heard this alleged dialogue. There is no physical evidence of intent. You are asking this jury to ruin a good man's life based entirely on your own bitter imagination." I looked directly at Vance. Then I shifted my gaze slightly to look at my father, who was sitting with a smug, victorious smile spreading across his face. I looked at Arthur in the gallery, who practically looked like he was about to start clapping. They had built this entire massive, expensive defense on the absolute certainty that the digital evidence had been permanently destroyed. They were completely, utterly self-satisfied. They had fallen perfectly into the trap. I took a slow, deep breath, remembering Eleanor's advice. I did not raise my voice. I did not show anger. I simply leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the silent courtroom. "I do not need anyone to take my word for it, because they recorded themselves." The smug smile on Vance's face froze instantly. The absolute silence that followed my statement was deafening. It was a thick, heavy quiet that sucked the oxygen entirely out of the massive courtroom. Vance blinked rapidly, his polished, aggressive demeanor faltering for the very first time. He looked quickly back at the defense table. My father's victorious smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion. Arthur, sitting in the front row of the gallery, suddenly sat bolt upright, his face draining of all color. Arthur knew exactly what I meant, and the terrifying realization that his late-night hacking attempt had failed was clearly hitting him like a freight train. "Objection, Your Honor," Vance shouted, finding his voice and scrambling to regain control of the narrative. The witness is making wildly unfounded, highly prejudicial claims that were not disclosed in the pretrial discovery phase. The defense has received absolutely no audio evidence. Prosecutor Ramirez stood up slowly, calmly buttoning her suit jacket. She walked toward the center of the courtroom, holding a small, encrypted USB drive in her right hand. "Your Honor, if I may," Ramirez said smoothly. The state did not include this specific audio file in the initial discovery packet because the defense actively attempted to permanently destroy it just 12 hours ago. We have the digital forensics to prove that an unauthorized remote wipe was initiated on the victim's iCloud account from an IP address directly registered to Arthur, the defendant's oldest son. Fortunately, the victim's legal counsel had already established a secure, mirrored server chain of custody. This audio file is the direct, unedited recording from the 911 Emergency Dispatch Center, capturing the entire incident in real time. It is fully authenticated, time-stamped, and legally admissible. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic frenzy of whispers. The reporters in the back row frantically started typing on their laptops. Vance looked like he was going to have a massive heart attack right there on the courtroom carpet. He slammed his hands down on the defense table. "This is an outrageous ambush," Vance yelled, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "We demand an immediate recess to review this supposed evidence. This is a blatant violation of protocol." The judge banged his heavy wooden gavel loudly, demanding order. He glared down at Vance with absolute authority. "Counselor, you will lower your voice in my courtroom. If the state can prove the defense's family member attempted to actively destroy this evidence, I am admitting it immediately under the crime-fraud exception. The jury has a right to hear the facts. Prosecution, you may proceed with the audio playback." Arthur literally slumped forward in his seat in the gallery, burying his face in his trembling hands. His massive inheritance, his luxury condo, his entire privileged existence had just evaporated in front of his eyes. My mother began to hyperventilate, clutching my father's arm with white knuckles. My father simply stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. Ramirez handed the USB drive to the court technician. The technician plugged it into the central audio system. The massive speakers mounted on the courtroom walls crackled slightly as the file loaded. "This is the direct 911 dispatch recording from August 15th at 2:14 p.m., Ramirez announced clearly to the jury. The audio began to play. The sound quality was terrifyingly crisp. First, there was the heavy, sickening, metallic crunch of the solid steel Porsche door violently impacting my skull. The sound made several members of the jury physically flinch in their seats. Then came the heavy thud of my body hitting the searing asphalt. Then, my father's voice boomed through the courtroom speakers. It was not the smooth, charismatic, highly polished voice of the wealthy real estate CEO sitting at the defense table. It was the raw, unhinged, violent roar of a monster. "Maybe now your skull matches your IQ." The absolute vitriol in his recorded voice sent a visible shudder through the entire gallery. But the recording did not stop there. The jury heard my desperate, ragged whisper, "Help! Parking lot." And then came the final, devastating nail in the coffin. My mother's voice rang out clearly, slurred with expensive wine, echoing off the high mahogany walls. "The blood really brings out your worthlessness. Drama queen is probably faking. Slam him again." The audio captured my father's heavy footsteps shifting on the pavement, calculating the angle for a second strike, perfectly aligning with my testimony. It captured his panicked curses when the police sirens finally became audible in the background. It captured the exact moment the wine bottle shattered on the concrete. When the recording finally clicked off, the courtroom was plunged back into a stunned, horrified silence. I looked directly at the jury box. Two of the female jurors were actively weeping, holding their hands over their mouths. A male juror in the front row was glaring at my father with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The fabricated narrative of the loving parents and the greedy son had been completely, violently obliterated in less than 3 minutes. Vance slowly sank back into his heavy leather chair, running a trembling hand over his face. He knew it was entirely over. He had absolutely no defense against their own recorded words. But Prosecutor Ramirez was not finished. She was a master of courtroom theater, and she had one final, devastating card left to play. "Your Honor," Ramirez said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "The state calls its final witness to the stand. Mrs. Helen Higgins." Vance's head snapped up. My parents exchanged a look of sheer, panicked confusion. They had absolutely no idea who Mrs. Higgins was. Neither did I. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a small, elderly woman with silver hair walked slowly down the center aisle. She wore a simple floral dress and carried a small, sensible handbag. She looked like everybody's grandmother. She took the stand, swore the oath, and smiled politely at the jury. Ramirez approached the podium. "Mrs. Higgins, can you please tell the court where you were on the afternoon of August 15th? "I was loading my weekly groceries into the trunk of my car at the supermarket," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice clear and steady. "I was parked exactly 2 spaces away from a very large, dark blue SUV. And did you witness an altercation taking place at that vehicle?" Ramirez asked. "I did," Mrs. Higgins nodded firmly. "I heard a man shouting terrible things. I looked over and I saw that gentleman right there." She pointed a sharp, accusing finger directly at my father, violently pull that young man out of the car. And then, he took the heavy car door, and he slammed it into the boy's head with all of his strength. It was the most brutal thing I have ever seen in my 70 years of life. "Mrs. Higgins, what did you do next?" "Well, I am an older woman, and the man looked very dangerous. I knew I could not physically stop him," she explained logically. "So I reached into my purse, took out my smartphone, and I started recording a video. My grandson taught me how to use the camera last Thanksgiving. I recorded the whole thing." The entire courtroom gasped collectively. Ramirez turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the state introduces Exhibit C, a high-definition cell phone video recorded by Mrs. Higgins. She contacted our office directly after seeing Mr. Vance's smear campaign on the local evening news. She wanted the jury to see the absolute truth." The video was cast onto the massive flat-screen monitors facing the jury box. It was a perfectly clear, unobstructed view of the parking lot. The jury watched in high definition as my father committed the brutal assault. They watched my mother casually sipping wine while I bled on the ground. They watched the visual confirmation of every single horrific word they had just heard on the audio recording. It was an absolute, flawless legal massacre. My father buried his face in his hands. My mother began sobbing hysterically, realizing that her wealthy, country club life was officially over. Arthur slipped quietly out of the back doors of the courtroom, trying to escape the inevitable fallout. I sat calmly on the witness stand, looking at the destruction of the people who had tortured me for 26 years. The trap had not just sprung, it had completely crushed them. The jury deliberation was aggressively short. They were out of the courtroom for less than 2 hours before the bailiff announced they had reached a unanimous verdict. The sheer speed of their return was a massive, undeniable indicator of how thoroughly the defense had been destroyed. The courtroom was packed even tighter than before. Word had spread rapidly through the legal community about the dramatic presentation of the audio and video evidence. Everyone wanted to witness the highly anticipated fall of the untouchable real estate titan. The judge asked the jury foreperson to read the decision. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman who refused to even look in the direction of the defense table, stood up holding a small piece of paper. "On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Richard, guilty. On the charge of aggravated felony assault, we find the defendant guilty." She paused, taking a steadying breath. "On the charge of accessory to attempted murder, we find the defendant, Margaret, guilty. On the charge of criminal endangerment, we find the defendant guilty." The heavy wooden gavel slammed down, sealing their absolute ruin. My mother collapsed entirely against the heavy oak table, wailing because the evidence was so overwhelmingly severe, and because my father had demonstrated an absolute lack of remorse throughout the entire process. The judge waived the standard waiting period and moved directly to sentencing later that same week. When the day of sentencing arrived, the judge did not hold back. He looked down from his high bench with profound disgust. In all my years presiding over this court, I have rarely seen such calculated, arrogant cruelty inflicted upon a person's own child, the judge stated, his voice booming through the microphone. You believed your wealth and your social status elevated you above the basic laws of human decency. You were entirely wrong. He sentenced my father to a mandatory 25 years in the state penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole. He sentenced my mother to 15 years in a medium-security facility. Before the bailiff stepped forward to formally handcuff them and transport them to the state prison, the judge allowed me to read my formal victim impact statement. I stood up from my seat beside Prosecutor Ramirez. I did not hold a piece of paper. I did not need notes. I walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly into my father's eyes. You spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, I said, my voice steady, carrying the weight of a survivor. You used your money, your power, and your sheer physical size to enforce a regime of terror in our home. You tried to execute me simply because you found the sound of my breathing offensive. But you made one critical, fatal mistake. You underestimated my will to survive. You thought you were crushing a weak boy. Instead, you forged a man who was strong enough to completely dismantle your entire empire. You are going to a place where your money means absolutely nothing. I turned my gaze to my mother, who was trembling violently. And you, I said coldly. You laughed while my blood poured onto the asphalt. You encouraged him to hit me again. You are not a mother. You are simply an accomplice. Enjoy the next 15 years of absolute silence. The bailiffs moved in. The satisfying, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs echoing in the quiet courtroom was the perfect ending to the symphony of their downfall. I watched them being physically. And then came the final, twisted betrayal that proved exactly how toxic my bloodline truly was. Aunt Beatrice, the woman who had stood in my hospital room and threatened me with blackmail to protect the family legacy, saw an incredible financial opportunity in my father's sudden downfall. With Richard locked away in state prison and his assets entirely frozen by my civil suit, the board of directors at his real estate firm panicked. The company's stock violently plummeted. Beatrice quietly gathered a group of ruthless corporate investors and aggressively executed a hostile takeover. She bought my father's entire, massive real estate empire for absolute pennies on the dollar, completely stripping him of his remaining corporate power and formally expelling him from the company he had built from the ground up. She betrayed her own family the absolute second it became financially profitable for her. When Clara told me the news about Beatrice's corporate coup, I simply smiled and took a sip of my coffee. Let them tear each other apart like starving wolves. It was not my circus, and they were no longer my monkeys. I had legally changed my last name. I had secured a substantial settlement from the civil suit, money I fully intended to use to build a life completely independent of their toxic shadow. Their entire world had violently collapsed, and I was finally standing safely outside the blast radius. Time is a remarkable, steady healer, especially when the source of your trauma has been permanently removed from your daily environment. Several years have passed since the heavy wooden gavel slammed down in that downtown courtroom, officially sealing the fate of the people who brought me into this world. The transition from a terrified, abused son to an independent, confident man was not an overnight miracle. It required years of intense, grueling psychological therapy. It required actively unlearning 2 decades of vicious gaslighting. I had to train my brain to stop apologizing for simply existing, to stop flinching when a heavy door slammed shut, and to finally understand that my worth was not determined by my father's bank account or my brother's manufactured success. I took the massive financial settlement from the civil lawsuit, and I invested it carefully. I did not buy a luxury sports car or a massive downtown condo like Arthur would have done. Instead, I used the funds to completely pay for my law school tuition. The grueling, high-pressure environment of law school was demanding, but after surviving 26 years in Richard's house, passing the bar exam felt like an absolute walk in the park. Today, I am a prosecuting attorney for the state. I work in the exact same courthouse where my parents were sentenced to prison. Every single day, I put on a suit, I walk past the heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B, and I fight aggressively for people who have had their voices violently stolen from them. I specifically handle severe domestic violence cases. When I stand in front of a jury and I point at an abuser sitting at the defense table, I am not just doing my job. I am actively channeling the terrified young man who lay bleeding on the searing asphalt. I know exactly how these predators operate. I know their manipulative tactics, I know their arrogant smirks, and I know exactly how to completely dismantle their fabricated defenses. My best friend Clara is now a junior partner at Eleanor Sterling's prestigious corporate law firm. We meet for coffee every Tuesday morning, a quiet, peaceful tradition that grounds me. She was the absolute bedrock of my survival, the only person who firmly believed my truth when the entire world was being paid to doubt me. But my most important work does not happen inside the courtroom. 3 nights a week, I volunteer my time at a local, confidential crisis hotline for at-risk teenagers. I sit in a quiet, dimly lit room, wearing a headset, and I listen to the desperate, terrified whispers of kids who are currently trapped in the exact same nightmare I miraculously survived. They call me from locked bathroom stalls, from dark closets, hiding from the monsters who live in their own homes. When a young boy calls me, crying silently into the receiver, absolutely terrified that his abusive father is going to hear him breathing, I know exactly what to say. I do not offer empty platitudes. I tell him the absolute truth. Keep breathing, I whisper into the microphone, my voice steady and completely calm. Take a deep, full breath. Do not make yourself small for them. Keep your phone ready. Document absolutely everything you can. Record their words, take photos of the damage, and send it to a secure cloud server they cannot access. You are not crazy. You are not the problem. Your existence is not a burden, and your truth absolutely deserves to be heard. I teach them how to systematically build their armor. I teach them how to turn their immense fear into cold, calculating, undeniable evidence. I teach them how to survive until they can finally escape. The physical scar on my right temple has slowly faded into a thin, jagged white line curving just above my hairline. I do not try to hide it with my hair anymore. I do not cover it up with makeup. When colleagues or strangers ask me about it, I do not lie and say I fell off a bicycle or had a clumsy accident. I look them dead in the eye and I tell them the absolute, unvarnished truth. My father tried to kill me by crushing my skull because I breathed too loudly, but I breathed long enough to hit the send button on my phone and sent him to state prison. The scar is not a mark of weakness. It is not a symbol of victimhood. It is my permanent, undeniable huanchuang of survival. It is the absolute proof that sometimes the smallest, quietest acts of defiance, like pressing a single button on a screen, can completely topple the tallest, most arrogant tyrants. My parents thought they could permanently silence me by violently crushing my skull in that parking lot. Instead, they handed me the exact microphone I needed. They amplified my voice through a 2-minute emergency recording that will follow them like a dark shadow for the rest of their miserable lives. Every single time my father comes up for a parole hearing decades from now, that audio recording will be played loudly in the room. Every single time my mother tries to file an appeal, her drunken, cruel laughter will echo through the legal chambers. Slam him again. Those words sealed their fate permanently. They wanted a son who would quietly take their abuse. What they got was the architect of their absolute destruction. Breathing is not a crime. Family is supposed to be your ultimate safe haven, but sometimes, the most toxic, dangerous predators are the ones sitting across from you at the Thanksgiving dinner table. You owe absolutely nothing to the people who consistently break you down, even if you share the same DNA. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a hard, unforgiving boundary to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.